Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Miami Book Fair and Harvard Bookstore in Boston, Massachusetts, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Karen Joy Fowler to discuss her new novel, Booth, published by our friends at Putnam. Karen Joy Fowler is the New York Times best-selling author of 6 novels, including the Jane Austen Book Club and We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves, which was the winner of the PEN/Faulkner Award and shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize. Her debut novel, Sarah Canary, won the Commonwealth Medal for the Best First Novel by a Californian, was listed for the Irish Times International Fiction Prize, as well as the Bay Area Book Reviewers Prize, and was a New York Times notable book. Her novel, Sister Noon, was a finalist for the 2001 PEN/Faulkner Award for Fiction. Fowler's short story collection, Black Glass, won the World Fantasy Award in 1999, and her collection, What I Didn't See, won the World Fantasy Award in 2011. To moderate this evening's conversation, we're joined by Ruth Ozeki, a novelist, filmmaker, and Zen Buddhist priest. She is the award-winning author of 4 novels, The Book of Form and Emptiness, which has just been longlisted for the Women's Prize in England, My Year of Meats, All Over Creation, and A Tale for the Time Being, which was a finalist for the 2013 Booker Prize. Her nonfiction work includes a memoir, The Face, A Time Code, and the documentary film Halving the Bones. She's affiliated with the Everyday Zen Foundation and teaches creative writing at Smith College. Just a quick reminder that throughout this evening's broadcast, you can post questions below in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. And please order your copy of Booth from your favorite neighborhood indie bookstore, Books and Books, or Harvard. And thanks for your support. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage. Hello.
Hello, how are you? Oh, there's Karen.
Here I am.
Yay. Hello, Christina, thank you so much for that lovely intro.
Yes, thank you. That was lovely.
Yeah, and Karen, it's so wonderful to see you.
That's great.
I'm so excited.
We're sort of side by side.
I know, exactly. I wish I could just kind of reach through, but it doesn't seem to work.
It doesn't. Keep trying.
All right, I'll just keep trying through the whole conversation. So, Karen, I finished reading, I should say rereading Booth again last night, and I just want to be very clear about this right from the start. This book is truly a masterpiece. It is just extraordinary. And I know that this is true because the other day I ran into Kelly Link. And she and I agreed that this is your best book ever. And so if Kelly says so.
If I've got Kelly and Ruth Ozeki, what more can I ask for, honestly?
Exactly. I mean, she's a genius and everything, too. So we know that this is true,
That's
right?
right. Yeah, she's a certified genius.
A certified genius, exactly. And so when I say best, what I mean is I think it's your biggest book and it's your most important book. And I think it's your most powerful book. And I also think in many ways it's your most heartbreaking book. And I feel like I'm going to just ask you to sit there quietly for a while, and I'm going to
I can do that.
And I'm going to tell you just for another minute. I'm going to tell you exactly why I think this, just in case there's any question about this. All right. First of all, the story is just absolutely riveting. The historical world is rich and full of these like marvelous and unexpected details. It's concerned with, issues, slavery, institutional racism, class, insurrection that have never really been more timely. The characters, the Booths, are insane, and they are so compelling and flawed and just beautifully drawn, really compassionately drawn. And the language and the tone of the writing just astonishes me. It's so subtle and so precise and so interesting. And I would love to have time to really talk about that later on. And finally, one of the things that's sort of was surprising to me yesterday again, right? Mind you, like I'd already read the book once, and I was familiar with the history, right? The fact that I know what's going to happen at the end doesn't seem to matter, and it is just so suspenseful. And last night too, I just found myself turning the pages, just waiting to find out what happened, even though I already knew. So, like, how does that even happen? How do you do that? It's just an epic novel. And what I think is so interesting about it is that it's an epic novel, but it's also an anti-epic novel, in that I think that somehow you manage to question what an epic novel is or what it can be. And so anyway, these are the reasons I think this is just genius, and congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah. We could stop now, as far as I'm concerned.
So let's start. I mean, I want to kind of come back to some of these ideas about, certainly about epic and voice and language and all of that. But let's kind of go back in time and start at the beginning. And I'm thinking about here, Whidbey Island, in 2013, 2014. I'm thinking about a walk we took. This was right after the publication of We Are All Completely Beside Ourselves, right after the publication of A Tale for the Time Being, because we managed to get our publication schedules kind of in sync there.
Yeah, we've tried to sync up. And, as it takes me longer and longer to write a book, I take great comfort I see Ruth's book isn't out yet. I've still got time.
At this rate, we're just going to get slower and slower too. We're going to influence each other in terrible ways. But I remember that conversation because we were talking about, two things. First of all, whether we would ever write another book, and if so, what that book might be. And I remember that at the time, you certainly, I think we both were on the fence about the weather part of that. It seemed really dubious at the time. But that was the time when you confessed to having an obsession about the Booth family, and said that, if you were to write another book, then it might be about the Booths. And I'd read a short story that you'd written about John Wilkes Booth, and I remember just being immediately just taken with this idea. So can you tell us a little bit about this, about your interest in the Booth family and the genesis of the novel?
Absolutely. It's a bit of a long story, so I'll try to hit the high points. But it did begin with a short story that I wrote called Standing Room Only. And this is actually a time travel story. And the story arose because I had been reading some time travel stories and growing increasingly irritated. I just thought that people from the future blended too effortlessly into the world of the past. And I thought it wouldn't be like that. Time travel would just be another form of tourism. And I live in Santa Cruz. I live in a tourist town. And I know the tourists when I see them. They do not blend easily into the landscape. So I thought, well, time travelers would behave like tourists always behave. They would complain about the food. They wouldn't be able to handle the money. We would know them when we saw them. And so I wrote a short story. I went from that to thinking there would probably be packaged destination vacations, deals you could get to take your time travel holiday. And this now strikes me as an extremely cynical thing to think, but what I did immediately think was that a number of people would go see the Lincoln assassination. So that was the genesis of this story, that all these tourist time travelers have come to Washington, D.C. On the day that Lincoln will be assassinated. And in order to write that story, I did a lot of research into the conspiracy and the events just right around right around Washington, D.C. at that time. But in the process of doing that, I came across John Wilkes Booth's very famous older brother, Edwin. And I read an account written at the time of Edwin's return to the stage after the assassination. Edwin was a very successful Shakespearean actor. And it was a very, very moving story. And so I wrote another short story involving that, recounting Edwin's return to the stage. And by that time, I was just totally immersed in the Booth family. I did more research for that story, and I was just completely hooked at that point. I did go on to write a third story about Junius Booth, the patriarch in the family, and a funeral that he held for passenger pigeons. But by then, I had a reaction that will, I assume, not be unfamiliar to many in the audience, of kind of despair about the level of gun violence in the country. And I started to think about the families of the shooters. Obviously, the families of the victims are going through an unimaginable horror, but the families of the shooters have their own special kind of horror. And because I was so immersed in the Booth, I put those two things together and thought, I will look at the family of John Wilkes Booth and try to assess what culpability they may or may not have had, what the impact on them was, how they responded, and what it's like to love somebody that the rest of the world sees is a monster.
Wow, that's fascinating. What was it, about the Booths that that kind of drew you? I mean, it's a wild and crazy family. I can imagine falling into it and just never being able to. Yeah, I mean,
you answer your own question.
Yes, right,
it was just that they were I mean, they themselves were bizarre. The whole family dynamic was bizarre, starting especially with their father, but also that they happened to be on the fringes of a lot of the great events of the century. That Edwin Booth was in California touring the mining camp, so there's a connection to the gold rush. John Wilkes Booth managed to talk himself into the cell where John Brown was being held before he was hanged, and was there for the hanging. 3 of the Booths were in New York City during the draft riots, the horrific mob violence of the draft riots, so that through the lens of this one family, I managed to have a window into many of the most iconic events of the period.
The draft riot scene that you was just really terrifying, because I know New York, and I know the Gramercy Park area where they were, where Edwin and his wife were living, and just the way you evoked that riot. I had known something about Civil War history, but I guess I didn't know about that, and it was one of the more sort of terrifying moments in the book. Yeah.
Interestingly to me, I could not find any mention the Booths made of being involved in this, of being in this very perilous position. The account comes from the Union soldier they were sheltering at the time, and he wrote about being in the Booth house and about the risks they took to try to keep not only him, but there was a young Black man also who had been attending him. The soldier had been wounded, and this young Black man had been nursing him. And, so when the mob was specifically looking for Union soldiers and sympathizers and Blacks, they were sheltering both of them. And the mob, was mere blocks away from their house at the time. But again, it strikes me as very strange that it's nothing that they ever spoke about.
Yeah. Do you have any sense of why that might be?
No, none at all. Except that, well, this actually doesn't strike me as an explanation at all. But they were, with the exception of John, who obviously took very much a different tact. They believed that as actors, it was important that they be apolitical, that they not alienate any part of their audience by expressing views. They also, with the exception of John, the family was opposed to slavery. But there, you can find very little in their letters or their books where they actually address the issue at all. It's as if they aren't even seeing it.
That was one of the most interesting, I think, aspects of reading this book too. Is the way that they stayed apolitical, and that that all of the politics were happening, but it was just slightly outside.
They were very involved in the politics of the stage.
Right?
Its own little hothouse of intrigue.
Yeah. I learned so much about the theater, which I didn't.
So did I.
Yeah. I mean, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. It was the system as I understand it. And, I always feel a little awkward because I am just a novelist, and there are people who really know these things that I am pretending to know. But this is my sense, is that it was a star system, and that towns with big towns and smaller towns had their own companies, and the companies would provide all of the supporting players, and then the star would tour. The star would arrive and step in to a role, and the plays that were produced were fairly similar. So very little rehearsal would actually be required. The actors would already know the play they were doing. It was just a matter of adjusting to the new star who had arrived. And this must have meant, a lot of comparisons. You would go see one person's Richard III, and then you would see another person's. And again, the supporting cast would all be the same. You would be just looking for the difference of interpretation that the star meant. But I also got very caught up in the particular play of Our American Cousin, which is the one that Lincoln was watching when he was killed. And this came from England, but a woman named Laura Keene adapted it very significantly. She was one of the very few women who had her own theater and her own company. And she worked on this play. It was kind of a work in progress over many, many performances. They kept refining it, and they kept refining it. It was hugely popular. And then some people from her company went to Philadelphia and staged the same play. And she sued them because they had, absolutely copied all of the adjustments that she had made. And the court case went on for 9 years while the courts tried to decide, could you own the way a line was delivered? Could you own the gestures around the way a line was delivered?
That's fascinating. Yeah.
And then Laura Keene was performing in Our American Cousin on the night that Lincoln was shot, and Mary Lincoln understandably fell to pieces, and Laura Keene made her way from the stage up to the box and held Lincoln's head in her lap, and I think paid a price in terms of her own career, because she was a comic actress and people did not find her funny anymore. She was so bound up in the assassination. She was one of the many innocent victims of John Wilkes Booth's bullet.
Wow. That's amazing. Of course, I had to go online, and I started Googling photographs, right? And there are just such wonderful photographs of all of the actors in the family, John Wilkes Booth and Edwin Booth,
Yes.
and of course Junius, the father.
Yes.
It really,
But I
really
will
beautiful.
say that, nobody ever seems to have mentioned Asia without saying what a beauty she was. And you look at the pictures of Asia and you're thinking, what are they talking about?
I was thinking the exact same thing. I was wondering if, because that comes across in the book that, that you use the adjective beautiful to describe her in a way that struck me as being slightly ironic. I could just hear a little bit of irony in that. And certainly and I think maybe that's what made me want to start Googling them and seeing pictures. Now, there aren't a lot of pictures of Asia, certainly nothing compared to the number of pictures of her brothers.
No.
But she was certainly not a beautiful woman. And so I, wonder if that, the references to her, as being beautiful were not wishful thinking exactly, but, sort of an effort to kind of prop her up in some sort of way.
I just assumed that she must have been so vivacious that if you didn't have the frozen image, that perhaps she, and then also taste change, What we think of as beautiful is not what our forebears thought of as beautiful.
Well, the boys were certainly handsome in a very timeless way. Yeah,
that is true.
Where did you, what did you do for research? Where did your material come from? How did you even, begin to, there's just so much here.
There is, and there is so much material about the Booths. So, finding the material was not the difficult part at all. It's everywhere. But determining, separating out fact from mythology was the tricky part, because the minute John Wilkes Booth killed Abraham Lincoln, the mythologizing began. And so, there are many narratives and many incidents that appear in many, many sources, but if you try to trace them back to their absolute beginning, they seem very doubtful by the time you get there. But I also should mention that I had this enormous, unexpected gift from Terry Alford, who's written a magnificent biography of John Wilkes Booth. And I was reading his book, and in a book that is meticulously footnoted, there was one story that I had never heard before about Edwin that I wanted. And I could not find anywhere but in his book. So eventually I emailed him and I said, can you tell me what the source for this story is? And he emailed me back and he said, oh, you're writing a book about the Booths. I've been studying this family for 30 years. Perhaps you'd like to see my papers.
Oh my God.
So he just handed me 30 years of research. And the book would have been so very different and so very much less accurate without that incredibly generous gift.
Wow. I mean, I got the sense from reading the book that that there was that some of the firsthand, primary source material came from Asia, and that, Asia, the character.
Yes.
And, her letters and her writing.
They love John Wilkes Booth in China.
Exactly right. But so and the details, so many of the details I think that you included they were so precise and sort of moving, and just really sort of brought the world to life, and I loved that.
They do come from her. She was a very good writer. I think, although she was not the most likable person in the family, I think she was the smartest person in the family, and certainly the best educated of the siblings. And she wrote 3 books. 2 of them are quite dry. They're about her father and they're about Edwin, and they just really follow their theatrical careers. But in her heartbreak after the assassination, she wrote a book about John, and it is very intimate, and it has all of those details and all of the stories that I used. And she knew as she wrote it, that she couldn't publish it. It's such a loving portrait of her brother. She knew that nobody would want that. And so she left it with a friend when she died and said, maybe the day will come when you can publish that. And many decades later, Putnam did, in fact, publish the book.
Wow. Amazing. Amazing. I wanted to talk about, since we're talking about Asia and the characters. So the book is told from the point of view of Rosalie, the elder sister, Edwin, and Asia, right? But I guess what I'd like to do is just I was looking at a copy of Black Glass, your collection of early fiction. And in that book, you wrote, in the preface to that book, you wrote that you suffer from the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern syndrome, an excessive concern with peripheral characters. And I just have to read this out loud because it's so, I just love this. At its core, this focus on the peripheral is a struggle against literature's ubiquitous suggestion that some people are more important than others. This is a deeply outrageous, globally damaging thing to believe, but I haven't yet found a way to write that doesn't inevitably partake of it. So this I thought was really so interesting to kind of butt up next to Booth, because, Booth is, as I said, I think it's an epic, but it's also an anti-epic. And it questions the very nature of what an epic can be. And so I guess my question is, with Booth, which is a book entirely about peripheral characters, did you find a way to do this? Did you find a way to write about, yeah.
On a Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, I would answer this question one way, and on a Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, I would answer it another way, and on a Sunday, I would refuse to answer it. So it's tricky because, I really, truly did not want John Wilkes Booth to dominate this book. I wanted to argue that people who don't kill presidents can be just as interesting as people who do. And that actually killing a president is a pretty cheap way to get history's attention. I don't like John Wilkes Booth, and I did not want to write a book about him. And yet, there's just no way around the fact that I would not be writing the book if John Wilkes Booth hadn't killed Lincoln. That there wouldn't be the same level of interest in this family, not only from the rest of the world, but from me, without the assassin in the nest. So, and I am constantly aware that even in the many, many pages where John Wilkes Booth is somewhere else and nobody is talking about him, that the reader is thinking about him, that, that he looms over every page, and that when he does appear, there is a different sort of charge for the reader because he's there. So I don't, I gave it my best shot. I don't think I can claim to have succeeded in actually pushing John Wilkes Booth out of the spotlight he so desperately desired.
Okay, so I kind of disagree.
Good.
I think that you managed to do exactly this, to write about peripheral characters, in a way that makes them, that brings them into the center. And maybe even that's a little bit misleading, because what I felt at the end of it, and this is my second reading, but what I felt at the end was that you'd managed to create a kind of web of interrelatedness, right? And so you couldn't pull out any one of the characters. You couldn't separate John Wilkes from, this kind of network that he was a part of. And so my interest in it was partly, how did this group of people, what was the sort of the aspects of the relationship that led to, this really tragic outcome, and then how did it affect them? So I wasn't really interested. I was interested in John Wilkes, but he wasn't the primary, focus of my interest. I was more interested in the way that the characters were explaining the situation to themselves, and the sense of trying to the way the characters were trying to understand what happened, and the way that the narrator was sort of positioning and describing the events that might suggest causes, but was not drawing conclusions. And I really appreciated that. So I felt it was very much about the totality of the family, but not necessarily just about John Wilkes at all.
Oh, I'm so glad, because that was certainly my intention and my hope. And like I said, it was just a struggle to keep John in his place as I wrote the book. But I honestly do not think that he's the most interesting of the siblings by any means.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, I felt like he was almost like a little bit predictable, but the siblings very predictable, but the siblings were more interesting. The other thing I think that you succeeded in doing that I thought was really fascinating was that by the way that you were focusing on the peripheral characters in this, astonishingly tragic and momentous historical moment, that you were kind of getting us as readers interested in the minutia of their lives, right? And so, so I'm reading and I want to find out about Asia's baby. I want to find out about Edwin's, trip to England, and whether he, and his marriage. And, so I'm really caught up in the minutia of all of their lives. And there certainly is a lot of it, right? I mean, it's just, it's so complex, right? And in a beautiful, rich, really rich sort of way. And at the same time, what's coming, right? That there's a war, that is, about to happen. And, that that the assassination is going to happen. And yet the reader is, you keep drawing our attention back to the household, everyday household stuff, and the enormous dramas that are happening within the household too. And what that does is it, in a very interesting way, it makes us as readers complicit too. It puts us in the position of a peripheral character to this enormous, tragic, historical event that's about to happen. We're all standing on the sidelines, preoccupied by our, finances and our loves and our daily lives too, right? And if you step back from that just slightly, it's like, oh, right, that's exactly what's happening now. That's exactly what's happening now. So it's just it was a really interesting strategy, I thought. Was that?
Well, I think, and it took me a while to become conscious of this fact, but I really flipped the strategy from We're All Completely Beside Ourselves, the previous book, which is organized around the fact that the people in the book know something that the reader does not know.
Yeah.
To this other, mirror image where the readers know things that the characters do not know.
Yeah.
And that, there was something tremendously moving to me about them not knowing, about, trying to imagine these people who have no idea what's coming to them. Even though, as I said, the readers all do. Although this will be interesting. I've done some interviews now with England. The book is coming out there next week.
Yeah.
And it is not common knowledge there that John, that they don't even, all of them recognize John Wilkes Booth's name. So in America, I would assume that if I say John Wilkes Booth, everybody has some idea of, everybody knows he killed Lincoln.
Yeah.
But it's going to be interesting to do these events in England where I cannot count on people knowing that.
Yeah. Wow. That's really interesting. I want to move on and talk a little bit about the narrative voice and kind of geek out on voice a little bit. But and I also want to invite you to read a little bit too, because I think that it'll be nice for people to to hear what we're talking about here. But I also want to be mindful of the time, and I also want to be mindful of making sure that the people who are listening have a chance to ask questions. So, I'm going to invite you once again, all of the people who are listening, to, pop your questions in the Ask a Question thing at the bottom of the screen there. And then we will come back to that. Okay, so voice. I am kind of obsessed with voice. Voice is one of the most interesting aspects, I think, of fiction writing.
Well, you are masterful at it.
Well,
I think it is one of your many gifts.
It is one of your many gifts too. And but one of the things that struck me is that, okay, so this book is told in the third person. I would call it an omniscient voice. This is a voice that I have so often tried very hard to master and have never been able to do it. The Book of Form and Emptiness was an attempt to write in the third person omniscient, and it failed, right?
I do not agree. I think that the voice of the book is exactly that. I think you have done it perfectly.
But it had to have a character attached to it. It became its own character, right? In a very overt way. So once again, it's not the sort of unseen, godlike voice, that narrative voice that's controlling the world. No, it ended up.
All right. It's a seen godlike voice. This is a distinction with no merit.
All right, fine. Anyway, so your Booth is told in the third person omniscient, and it's told in the present tense, right?
Yes.
But I do not get the sense that your narrator is a neutral, godlike, omniscient presence at all. I think that the voice is far more subtle, and I think it's sly. It shifts its focus between the three different point of view characters. So the book is told from the point of view of Rosalie, Edwin, and Asia, right? And then there's the little bits of Lincoln too, the little bits of the Lincoln story that pop in. So I'd like to kind of talk about this a little bit more, but I was hoping you could read a little bit for us. I think we said page 223.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And let me set this while Karen is looking for her page. Let me just set this up for the listeners. So in this sequence, it's 1854, and John Wilkes Booth and Asia Booth are both teenagers. They had been living in Baltimore. Karen, correct me if I'm wrong about this. They had been living in Baltimore, but now they've moved back to their family farm in Bel Air, Maryland,
That's
right?
correct.
And John, the family is not doing well financially. And John, who had been attending boarding school, a kind of posh Southern boarding school, has been taken out of school so that he can learn how to become a farmer. And he's not really happy about this. So in the scene that Karen's about to read, some of John's school friends from this St. Timothy's, I think, right? The school, right. Yeah. Have come to the farm to visit them, and the character Jess Wharton is one of these boys.
Jesse Wharton is a handsome boy with a wide smile and an open, readable face. He and John and Asia walk through the woods together, the leaves now more brown than red. But the sun is out and the day mild enough to sit on the steps down to the spring, and the place where Asia once made Edwin give her all his pebbles. The boys smoke their pipes, and the smell of tobacco wafts about. Asia fills and empties her cupped hand with cold water, listening to the music of it falling, but also to Jesse. He tells a story she's never heard before, a story of a wild river and a day in which John, sucked under by a powerful current, nearly drowned, which makes Asia suddenly remember the dream she'd had. She has a brief image of John floating face down amongst the books and chairs. For just a moment, she can't breathe. We thought we'd lost him for sure, Jesse says. We thought he'd never open those big eyes for us again. He throws his arm over John's shoulders, and John lays his cheek briefly on Jesse's hand. A thin column of smoke rises like a charmed cobra from the bowl of his pipe. No, I'm not to drown, he says, nor burn, nor hang, though my sister has long believed I'm marching towards a martyr's death. Does Asia believe that? She doesn't want to. Years later, she will write that it was a golden afternoon. She will write of her deep contentment, how she watched the two boys leaning together in the sunshine, so gifted, so beautiful, so brilliant, and wondered about their futures. Surely both would leave a shining mark upon the world. 8 years later, in April of 1862, Jesse Wharton will be killed in the Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. A captured Confederate, he'll be shot by the sentry on duty. Maybe he stuck his head out of the window, refused to retreat, and abused the sentry with awful oaths and the taunt that he was too cowardly to shoot. Maybe he was quietly minding his own business. In fact, had just looked up from his mother's favorite Bible verse when he was murdered suddenly and without cause. It all depends on who you ask. All of this was known to Asia when she wrote about his shining mark. But on that lovely quiet afternoon, she was unaware and unconcerned. The war was several years and a handful of verses to the beautiful Miss Booth in the future. So I would like to say something about this section before I let you talk about it, which is that what I like about the omniscient voice in this case is the freedom that it gives me, not only to share with you things that I know that you as the reader may not know, but also to be very honest about what I don't know, which I think, the whole endeavor of writing a historical novel is quite indefensible in so many ways. If you believe, as I believe, that memory is extremely unreliable, that eyewitness accounts are extremely unreliable, then how can you possibly have faith in anything that is in the historical record, particularly for a family like this and the event of Lincoln's assassination, which gave rise to such narratives, polished narratives, revised narratives. So I like being able, as in the case of how Jesse Wharton died, how that came about. I like the ability to tell you that I do not know.
And that's, I think that is exactly what I wanted to ask you about. So I'm glad what was interesting to me was the way that, sort of reality split there. That there were two different realities that suddenly, it was almost like time sort of split, the world split. There's this reality where this happened to Jesse, and there's this reality where this happened to Jesse. And the way that the narrative voice kind of accommodates, as you say, not knowing, right, is that strikes me as being one of those moments of where the book, becomes not an epic, but an anti-epic, right? It's one of those moments where the genre of the epic falls away because, it's almost the voice is questioning itself. And I just thought that was really powerful. Did you know right from the start that you were going to be writing in the third person omniscient? Did you know that it was going to be in the present tense? Were there any other considerations that you were?
I like the third person omniscient. I realized many years ago that in books that have omniscient voices, still most of the narrative takes place in the third person limited. You slip in, you slip out. But much of my book and much of other books that use this voice do slip in and out. And I think that I think that we've been sort of trained maybe by the movies to start with a big view and focus in. You can imagine the establishing shot up in the clouds, and then it swoops down onto the city and then through a window into a kitchen. And at the end of a book, we're trained to pull back in that same way. I think it makes us very uncomfortable, and maybe I'm speaking for myself, if that hasn't been established at the beginning, and we're suddenly pulled out in a book that we thought was going to be a much more limited one. So yeah, this is a decision that I would necessarily make very early in the book. And it's a voice that gives me as the writer enormous freedom, as I said, to include things that I know that may have happened. I mean, there's information in the book from 2021 that is included in some of these narrative passages. And then also, as I said, to be honest about things that I don't know. The present tense, I think, is just, I sat down and that is just the way it happened. And I had this revelation reading Lauren Groff's The Matrix quite recently, which is also in present tense.
Present tense, that's right.
That I just think Hilary Mantel has so impacted us that's now the tense we think a historical novel operates in.
Isn't that interesting?
Always felt natural to me to be in the present tense, and that is not a tense that I use in other books, or that I move to very often. But every time I tried to move it into something more ordinary, it just didn't feel right.
Wow, that's really interesting.
You and I were in the British Library, and we saw the portrait of Hilary Mantel above the stairs. You remember?
Yeah.
There's just the tentacles of that woman. They just reach everywhere.
Exactly.
Even into my own books.
Into your own voice. I know. One of the things that really that I loved about the this third person omniscient narrator is and this voice is its agility, and the way that what it can do to time and to chronology, that it can kind of leap through time. It can jump, from the past into the future. It can, sort of compress stories into exactly the right amount of space, that a reader can handle at any moment. But it can also kind of create juxtapositions. Like there's a moment, for example, when suddenly we learn, it's in the middle of, it's like 1862 or something like that. And, we're in the middle of the Civil War, and suddenly you drop in information about the Dakota War.
Yes.
Can you talk about that? I thought that was amazing, because it suddenly, it was like it reframed everything and made it so much bigger.
This is the war in Minnesota.
Yeah.
With
the Sioux.
So during in the midst of the Civil War, there was this war on a completely separate front. The Native Americans in the Minnesota area had sold some land to the government for what they believed was a vast sum of money. The chief who organized the sale believed that he had taken care of his people for generations to come, except that the money was never given to them.
Yeah.
And so they lost their land, they got nothing, and they actually began to starve. And they began to starve at a time when the white settlers had a lot of food, and a lot of food in storage, which they would not share. And so the settlements were attacked. I actually think, I'm not positive about this, but I think this is something discussed in the Laura Ingalls Wilder books.
Okay.
These attacks.
Yeah.
And so Lincoln is fighting the other war, and suddenly there's a war in Minnesota that he also has to deal with. It did not last very long. The government troops put down the uprising fairly quickly, but many of the Native Americans who were involved were arrested and then in a very perfunctory set of trials, sentenced to hang. And Lincoln went through these court documents case by case by case, and he made a distinction between people that he felt had engaged the soldiers on the battlefield, in a place where it was, warrior against warrior. And he commuted all of their sentences. And the ones that he left in place to be hanged were the ones that he felt had attacked the settlements and had murdered women and children in a way where they had no way to defend themselves. So it's sort of simultaneously the biggest act of clemency that any president has ever offered, because so many people had their sentences commuted. But it is also at the same time the biggest mass execution that the government has ever participated in.
Yeah. When I read that, it just shifted the historical landscape for me in a very, sort of sudden and shocking and profound way. So, yeah. I'm going to move to a question here from Patty. Patty writes, after doing so much research, it seems like it could be challenging to write this as fiction versus a nonfiction text. You said Rosalie was completely fictionalized, but was it hard to fictionalize other characters and events? And then any tips for writers who are attempting this?
It was interesting because the challenge of writing the characters for whom I had a great deal of information and the challenge of writing the character for whom I didn't have a great deal of information were just two completely different experiences, completely different processes. And I liked both of them for different reasons, and I found them both difficult for different reasons. My writing group, who read the book chapter by chapter, were very offended that Edwin Booth forced, in order to marry Edwin, the very young woman who was in love with him was made to give up her own career on the stage. Edwin would not marry her unless she gave up her career. And my writing group they just kept wanting that not to be the case. They kept, saying that they didn't like Edwin as much. And I just thought, what can I do? What can I do? There's nothing I can do. But Rosalie, I could make more likable whenever I wanted to. I think that when you write a historical novel, an enterprise, which I have done many times, in which I have already told you, I think is completely dodgy and very suspect. You can put the emphasis on history, or you can put the emphasis on novel, historical novel, where are you going to land? And because it is a novel, the choice is yours. I think it's inevitable that readers will wonder which parts are true and which parts aren't, and that you should own up when asked. But it's a novel. You're under no obligation to follow anything you don't want to follow if you don't want to follow it. I did want to be accurate wherever I could be accurate. So I did not allow myself the freedom to make a lot of things up, partly because their lives were so bizarre. Anything I could imagine was going to be banal by comparison to what they were actually doing and saying and thinking. I'm just giving you my blessing to do whatever seems best to you.
Great. And this is a question from Isabel. What is something new you learned about writing a book through writing Booth?
I was going to say this earlier when we were talking about voice and then forgot. So thank you, Isabel. I have never written a book that covered so much time. that, and that was a struggle for me. Almost every other book I've written takes place within a 6-month period. And there's forestory and there's after story, but the actual plot of the book is pretty compressed. So this is the first time that I tried to cover decades, and that was a problem that I thought a lot about and fussed a lot about and worked a lot, worked hard on, and much of my solution was in the voice that Ruth has already talked about, which allowed me to jump about if I wish to. But I don't know that I will do that again soon. But it was, what I like about writing, honestly, is the problem solving. And so to have a problem that I don't know how to solve keeps me interested, is what I like. Although I will say, and I'm speaking here for Ruth as well as myself, that the next book each of us writes is going to be very, very short.
Very short and fast too.
Yes.
Really fast. So I have one more question, and it's a question about ghosts. Ghosts, fill the book. The very first section, Rosalie's section, has ghosts of children. Ghosts continue to appear from time to time. Edwin's best known role is Hamlet, who is haunted by the ghost of his father, and certainly these children were as well. And then the novel ends with ghosts, too. And so I just wanted to ask you to talk about this and talk about the way talk about haunting.
I think, that there are a few things that I would wish to say in response to that. And one of them is that, Shakespeare is to blame. If Shakespeare didn't have ghosts, I probably wouldn't have had ghosts either. This is a family. This is a family absolutely steeped in Shakespeare's plays, or at least in Shakespeare's plays as adapted by Colley Cibber.
Yeah.
But also, and I think this also may be one of the reasons why present tense felt right to me, that there are, that the issues of the Civil War have just never been solved. They are the ubiquitous and enduring problems of American society. And so the ghosts at the end of the book really stand in for that, the fact that we are still haunted by the Civil War and by the period before the Civil War as well, that I want to believe, as Martin Luther King told us, that although the arc of the universe is slow, it bends towards justice, but I'm not at all sure I believe it. Part of me just thinks, no, it just swings back and forth and back and forth. Also, just to be very literal, one of the things that I discovered that was so interesting, but I couldn't fit it in the book because it wasn't the tone I wanted at the end, is the fact that that Ford's Theater collapsed during Edwin Booth's funeral, and horrifically, with more than 20 people killed and nearly 100 people injured. And I mean, that was just such a strange and unexpected fact that I did not know. But including it made Edwin look like a very vengeful ghost. And I do not think Edwin is a vengeful ghost. And in point of fact, his ghost is seen in an opera house in Georgia from time to time. And he's a very helpful, very affable ghost. He helps actors find the props that they have mislaid. And so it just would have been wrong to accuse him of killing a number of people by collapsing Ford's Theater.
Wow. That's amazing. And it's lovely just as an example of what to leave out. Right. What to leave out of of the historical record. Yeah. Because of course it is fiction. It's a novel and it needs to be shapely in its own way. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Thank you so much, Karen. I think that brings us pretty much to
What
the end of our conversation.
I feel like I have to show you something, and I don't know if you're going to be able to see it from here, but
Is it a ghost? Is it a ghost?
let me just show you what hangs right here.
Oh, it is a ghost.
It
absolutely is.
It's there always. So I just feel like I had to show it to you.
That's great.
But what a fantastic conversation. And here you go. Look.
Nice. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being with us, for supporting Books and Books and Harvard.
Absolutely.
And what a great conversation. I think you missed this, Karen, but look.
Oh, yes.
Side by side. We love you. We're so happy to have your books on our shelves. And
thank you
such
so
a
much.
wonderful conversation. And we're just very, very grateful that you're here and that you're publishing these fantastic books. So,
well, we are very grateful for your attention and your time.
and
you at the bookstore and you people who came to listen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And thank you, Karen, for an amazing book.
Thank you, Ruth.
Good night, everyone.